Hello and welcome to Art Block, the show where we talk about art and how it's made. I'm your host Spirit, and today on the chopping block is the full beginner's guide to Adobe Photoshop. Before we begin, I would just like to give a quick disclaimer that you do not need Adobe Photoshop to make good digital art. Photoshop has a lot of features that are shared by other programs such as Fire Alpaca, Krita, and even Sai. So even if you don't have Photoshop, this video is still a great tool for those who want to learn how to use any kind of art software. Since this is also a longer episode, if you're watching this through a second time or just need to get to a specific part, I've included timestamps which will take you to the various parts you'll need to go. Before you dive into the various features of Photoshop, you need to understand some of the stuff that comes included when you're making a new document. Photoshop documents are primarily saved as PSD files and are somewhat universally used with all of Adobe's other Creative Cloud products, such as Flash and After Effects, just to name a few. When you're starting a new document, you're going to have the option to name your document as well as some settings to change the dimensions, background color, etc. These here are your resolution boxes. They'll show the exact dimensions your canvas is going to be. Depending on your selected measurement, the numbers can range to the thousands to the single digits. This drop menu here lets you pick the measurement type for your document. As a recommendation, I would either use pixels, inches, or centimeters depending on what you're trying to make. Just underneath the resolution boxes and the drop-down menu here are your orientation and resolution options. Depending on the size of your document, I would recommend having at least 300 pixels per inch as your resolution if you want to make the picture look crisp. However, I just need to warn you, if you're going to work in a resolution that is less than 2000 by 2000 pixels, your document is going to look quite small. As for orientation, the portrait and landscape options are shown visually, which should hopefully make it a bit easier for you to choose. Here we have your color mode options and background color. These are a bit more technical, so if you're not too familiar with color coding and bitrate, then I would suggest sticking to RGB for your color mode and 8-bit for your bitrate. Background color is something that you can easily change while you're working on your project. However, if you want to set it before you go in, just click the drop-down menu and select one of the options, or click the small box here and choose the background color option in the drop-down menu. Lastly, we have the presets. These include your recent project formats as well as some of the pre-made options if you're ever in a hurry or you just don't want to fiddle with the technical aspects. These usually come in some standard resolutions as well as various print sizes if you're ever working on making posters or art prints. Now that we're in the software, it's time to go over some of the essentials of the program as well as some of the general tools that will make Photoshop much easier to use. For first, you need to decide what kind of work you'll be doing in Photoshop. Here in the top right hand corner is the Mode drop-down menu. Essentials generally has all you'll need if you're just playing around in the program. However, if you're making art, I would highly recommend you use and become familiar with the painting option for your selected mode. Now that we have our general layout for painting, here in the middle is our canvas. On the left are your tools, and on the right are your layers and your swatches. The most important thing that you'll find when it comes to using Photoshop is layers. Automatically when you start a document, you'll have a background layer that is usually locked and filled with an opaque color. This can easily be changed by simply clicking on the lock symbol. After that, you can delete the fill to make the layer fully transparent, or if you'd rather, you can keep the layer locked and choose a different background color. The advantage to using layers is that, especially when drawing, you can have your sketch on a different layer from your line art, and you don't have to worry about doing a ton of erasing or keeping your sketch really light like you would with a pencil. The way that you can tell you have a layer select is that the layer and its box will be highlighted, usually with a pale blue. Each layer aside from the background layer is automatically transparent and can be filled with your background layer color by hitting Ctrl+Delete, or Command-Delete if you're on a Mac. When layers are in a group, the group can be moved as a whole or compressed into one layer by using Ctrl-E or Command-E. Another option to keep track of when it comes to layers is the opacity and clipping masks. For layer opacity, you're going to want to make sure that your layer is selected before going over to the opacity bar and adjusting it accordingly. You can also type in a percentage of opacity if you need a specific amount, such as 50%, 75%, etc. As for clipping masks, you're going to want to make a new layer above the layer you want to have the mask over, and then go over to the drop menu and click on Create Clipping Mask. Clipping masks essentially are a way to color a line or text without getting a strange texture from using the Select tool. A layer with a clipping mask will have an arrow pointing at the layer that is being masked. For example, when I take this line work and color on the layer above without a clipping mask, it appears to be quite messy and a bit out of place. However, if we turn on the clipping mask, the layer above is only showing where the layer below has stuff marked. Now then, on to the tools. For simplicity's sake, we'll be breaking these down to a few different portions. General, aka the Move tool, Zoom tool, Crop and Rotate tool, Selection, Lasso, Quick Select, Draw, Erase, Pencil, Paintbrush, Eyedropper, Eraser, Bucket tool, and the extra tools. pen tool, path selection tool, etc. When you're using the move tool, any layer that you have highlighted will move with your mouse if you click on it. You can also hit Ctrl T or Command T to transform your highlighted layer. Whenever you hit Ctrl T, the transformation options are always set to free transform. Right-clicking after hitting Command T will open up various options such as rotate, skew, warp, etc. Be sure to experiment with these options while you're working, as they are quite helpful when it comes to making your work process go by faster. Hitting Command plus and Command minus will zoom your view on the canvas. If you have a tablet or toolbar, you can program these to zoom in and out or scroll up and down on your canvas if necessary. Lastly, we have the crop tool. When you're clicking on the crop tool, your canvas size can be adjusted to be bigger or smaller depending on what you're currently working on. If you plan to expand your canvas, just keep in mind that your locked background color will be the one that fills your background color. Moving on to the selection tools, you'll have a few settings to be wary of when it comes to working with them. The first thing to know about is the rectangle and circle selection tool. To choose between the two, right-click on the rectangle tool and a drop menu will show your options. When you need to make a perfect circle or square, press and hold shift and drag the mouse while holding down left click. If you come up to this top bar here, you'll see various options that are shared by the rest of the selection tools. The two most important of these options are the selection layering options and anti-aliasing. The first thing I want to discuss is anti-aliasing. For those who don't know what anti-aliasing is, it's when the program will have a small fade of pixels and opacity to make the edges look smoother. Whenever you have the anti-aliasing box checked, the edges of your selection will overall be smoother and look nicer if you fill them in. If you have anti-aliasing turned off, your edges will end up looking pixelated similar to something made in MS Paint. The second thing is selection layering. Generally, Photoshop's default option will be single selection. If you're using any of the selection tools to create fills, I'd recommend using the Add to Selection option. This will allow you to make multiple selections at the same time without having to worry about constantly having to go back and forth between the layers. Moving on, you also have the Lasso tool. The Lasso tool allows you to make custom shaped selections, and similar to the Rectangle Selection tool, it has two options that can be accessed by right-clicking on the Lasso tool button. The second option for the Lasso tool is the Polygonal Lasso tool. This option allows you to make custom shapes or straight edges if you make a small enough shape. The Lasso tool overall is great for making quick, imprecise selections that are great for moving stuff around or making modifications. The Quick Selection tool and the Magic Wand tool are both made for working on already pre-established layers. The Quick Selection tool has multiple options for adding and erasing, as well as multiple size options. The Magic Wand tool selects any body of pixels within a certain range, and is the tool I and others will use when we're working on selecting fills or trying to work with a very specific document size. Next we have the painting tools. Starting off is obviously the paintbrush tool. If you come up to the top of the screen, you'll see a small symbol with a little number on it. When you click on this box, you'll be given access to the various brush types as well as an option to change the size and hardness of the brush. To use an example, the airbrush hardness is 0%, while the solid brush is 100%. Depending on how much blending you need, your hardness can help make your blending softer or more defined. Next we have brush opacity, which can be adjusted with a small slide bar. Reducing or increasing your brush opacity can help you when you're working on shading, and if you happen to be working with a tablet, you can click on this button here, which will determine your brush opacity based on pen pressure. If you click on this button here, your brush size will also change with the amount of pressure applied to your pen. Just above the paintbrush, we have the eyedropper tool. This tool is relatively straightforward. Just click on an area you want to get your color from, and it'll automatically change the foreground color. Though keep in mind that your color has to be in Photoshop, and it will not take colors outside of your document with the exception of maybe your desktop. The pencil tool works similarly to the paintbrush, except there's no anti-aliasing options. This tool is great if you're making any form of pixel art or you need to fill in a very specific area without having any opacity issues. The eraser tool works just like the paintbrush, except it removes pixels instead of adding them. The eraser also has a drop-down menu that allows you to pick between brush, pencil, and block modes if you need alternatives. You can also click on Erase to History, which will restrict your erasing to any recently made strokes. Lastly, we have the Paint Bucket tool. The Paint Bucket tool allows you to take the foreground color and fill in any nearby body of color with your new color. As a recommendation, please be sure that you're aware of what layer you're filling in on, as I can't tell you how many times I've accidentally used the Paint Bucket tool on my line art area, and it's proven to be somewhat of an annoyance. Now that we've covered the basics, it's time to go into some detail with what you can do with Photoshop, such as filters, custom brushes, and more. While these aren't entirely necessary, there are a few I want to point out that I have found useful while making artwork. Starting off, we have custom brushes. While Photoshop's brushes are pretty good as they are, picking up some custom brushes can help provide you with a lot more options when it comes to how you blend your colors and how you make your pictures really pop. In the description, I've linked to the custom brush set that I personally use and I would personally recommend to anyone who's wanting to make more painterly style artwork. Onto the filters and the drop-down menus, there's just a few that I would recommend trying to use if you're trying to make your process go a lot faster. If you go over to Layer, Layer Style, and then Satin, you'll be given the option to create a somewhat inner shadow or inner light that will add some dimension to your picture. In that same drop menu, you'll also see options such as drop shadows, inner and outer glows, and various overlays. These are tools that can help make your job faster and easier, so I'd recommend experimenting with them a bit. Filters are something you'll definitely have to experiment with. However, one I would recommend using the most is Gaussian blur. This blur option allows you to pick how many pixels the layer will blur, and it's great if you need to blur to a very specific extent. If you're going into photo manipulation, I would also recommend checking out the wind and distortion options. Since we've covered the basics and some of the extras, it's time to put what we've learned to use. Since I've been dying to try out a new style, I figured what better way to finish this off than with a new picture of Spirit using Photoshop. So I started off with a rough sketch to help establish the pose of the character. Since this picture was mostly going to be used for the title card, I made my canvas 2000 by 2000 pixels, so I had just a little bit of wiggle room when it eventually came to implementing the picture into the final product. Generally, when I'm sketching in Photoshop, I like to reduce my brush opacity to about 75% to give it a little bit rougher, more of a tangible feel to the drawing. Whenever I'm working with a white background, I like to work with either black lines or blue lines. As a tip, I like to reduce the opacity of my sketch layer so that I know what I'm drawing on my sketch layer versus when I'm drawing on a different layer with 100% opacity. One recommendation I would make is to draw a few roughs in your sketchbook or on some loose leaf paper with various poses and ideas for what the final product might look like. I do think it's important for everyone to understand that you don't always have to do everything in the software. In fact, if you're not particularly good at sketching in the computer, I would actually recommend drawing your sketch on paper first, then scan it into the computer for coloring and line art. After I've completed the rough sketch, it's time to work on the line art. I quickly saved my file as a PSD file, then reopened it in FireAlpaca to do the line art. While I do think that Photoshop is great for making art, I need to stress that it's not easy to make line art without a lot of practice or plugins. While Photoshop does have plugins that would allow you to make smooth line art, I've found that FireAlpaca is not only much easier to use when it comes to the stabilizer, it's also free and has much crisper lines than Photoshop's hard brush. You can also achieve a similar effect with Paint Tool Psi, however Psi and the Photoshop plugin are both restricted to PC only, so if you're using a Mac like me, I would recommend using FireAlpaca. After finishing the line art, it's time to reopen the file in Photoshop and begin coloring and shading. Using the Magic Wand tool, I selected the areas that I wanted to have filled and created a new layer underneath my line art. After that, I went up to Select, Modify, and expanded my selection by 2 to 3 pixels, and using the Bucket tool, I filled in my picture with my flat colors. Since I was in the mood for something a little bit more painterly this time around, I scrolled through my paintbrush options and selected a soft oil brush that would provide a nice painterly style to the finished piece. Using the paintbrush, I reduced the opacity to about 50% before creating a new layer with a clipping mask. With a new color for my brush option, I began to detail in my shading, occasionally selecting a midtone just to make the color more defined, and as I finished up, I created a new layer above the liner and created a clipping mask. With the same brush I was using to blend, I increased my opacity and used the eyedropper tool to make the line art blend with the rest of the piece. Lastly, I exported the file as a PNG file and began working on the title card for this video. Using Photoshop's text tool, I fiddled around with some of my options, even adding a little bit of chrome effect to the picture before going back into the illustration and adding some plugins to help it stand out. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That is my full beginner's guide to Photoshop and a bit of a run through of how I make my artwork. If you have any other tips on getting started with Photoshop, make sure to drop them in the comments below. If you liked what you saw, be sure to subscribe and share this video around. It helps support my channel and it may help someone else who's interested in starting art. Also be sure to check me out on Patreon where you can get access to resources such as tutorials, PSD files, and more. Today's featured artist is Ginkadia on DeviantArt. I hope I pronounced that name right. Definitely an artist who deserves more watchers than she already has. I'd recommend checking her out. Thank you so much for watching, I'm Spirit, and I'll see you next time.